Hello lovelies. Today we're taking a look at D20 Future, which comes from all the way back in 2004. So there's a certain amount of irony there. This is a Know Your Role video, not a review video per se. There will be some sort of review score at the end. But mostly this is an excuse to talk about the book and the context of the time and design and everything that was approached back then. It's kind of weird to think of this as being 20 years old. It makes me feel very, very old. Because a lot of what they present as the future is still the future, and it's surprising how much both has and hasn't changed since 2004. So, D20 at the time was trying to be all things to all people, and Wizards had a very sort of schizophrenic approach to the D20 license and the OGL. Part of the original concept, or at least how it was seemingly sold to the upper echelons, was that the license would mean that third-party companies would do all of the stuff that didn't make a particularly large amount of money, and that would free Wizards to concentrate on the core books and sort of the more luxury end, the more epochal, influential stuff. And it was never really intended by them to be something that people could produce their own independent games under, but they did. In some ways this is quite similar to the way in which a lot of people have tried to make games that really shouldn't be 5th edition compatible, to kind of chase that that network externality, that built-in audience that already knows the system and doesn't necessarily want to stray beyond the system but might want to play other games, which is unfortunate for those of us who produce independent games and games material, but hey ho, what you gonna do. There were at the time D20 versions of a lot of other people's games already coming out, and Wizards seemed to feel that they were missing out on some of that money. Even though it was supplying those things like adventures and settings and so on that they didn't really want to. A big problem under 2nd edition was that they felt they were competing against themselves, you know? So you had Forgotten Realms, you had Greyhawk, you had Dark Sun, you had Planescape, and the thought was that these were all competing internally with themselves, and so Wizards as a whole was perhaps missing out on money because people couldn't afford to collect everything, essentially. But meanwhile, with hindsight, we can see that all of that D20 support material, all of those third-party companies were doing massive amounts to drive sales of the 3rd edition core books. Nonetheless, it's just they were taking the OGL further than Wizards necessarily wanted them to, which is why they kind of scaled back during 4th edition as part of the reason for its failure, in my not so humble opinion, and why they tried to pull back when it came to 6th edition or 2024 edition or whatever you want to call it. The book mostly has a clean graphical look. Personally, I find the art far more effective in this more graphical, illustrative style than modern D&D is, with its sort of pastel mush on every page under 5th edition. I do think they've pulled it back a bit from that in the newer edition, so I'm happy to see that. So you will see a few illustrations more like these clean graphical pieces of line art, coloured line art, in the newer edition. So it's interesting to see kind of full circle, I guess. The font size is a little bit small and a bit eye strainy for us oldies, which immediately brings us to a bit of a problem with the whole book. See, I think the small font and the crowded layout is because they had way too much material to fit into the book size that they were willing to produce. So there's too little room. You don't just see this in the font, but topics bleed into one another. One thing leads directly into another on the page, and the new titles don't necessarily differentiate enough. So this is one character class, but it swaps here at Tracer, right? But that's not a particularly big title. It is a different font, but even so, it just kind of blends into the rest of the page, and so it's hard flipping through to locate exactly what it is that you're after and when to stop. Right, it's just slightly aggravating. Now, this is the result of a commendable attempt to provide value for money in a relatively small book, but it does inevitably leave a lot of things out, and it makes the book itself less usable. When it came to classes, see, D20 Modern had an interesting take. Probably the most interesting thing about D20 Modern and its spin-offs was that D20 Modern didn't have traditional classes like fighter, rogue, thief, whatever. You had strong heroes, fast heroes, tough heroes, smart heroes, dedicated heroes, charismatic heroes, each one tied to a statistic, and then you would construct your character from there, with special abilities related to whatever key statistic you had, but also skills and feats. And so this builds out from that. There's some new advanced classes which are like the old prestige classes. So as you leveled up, multi-classing was super easy under 3rd edition and its derivations. And at a certain point, if you met the prerequisites, you could take levels in what was called a prestige class. So this was a much more specialized or highly focused subclass rather than your main class. And so that's what you have here, though the prestige classes or advanced classes feel far more necessary in D20 Future than they do in Fantasy D&D or D20 Modern as a whole. And they also let you bring a little bit of character and setting into character creation for some of the subsettings. So that seems to be the main role of these advanced classes here. They take the concept of tech levels from Traveller and re-express it as progress levels. I can't fault that. It's a good idea, and you're going to need something similar to that in a lot of sci-fi games, so nothing wrong with that. Starting occupations. So this was a slightly more powerful background feature, something between the old background choices in 5th edition and the newer ones in 6th edition in terms of power levels. So yeah, somewhere it splits the difference, sort of. Maybe a bit more Pathfinder-esque. There are quite well expanded skills. Modern games required more skills anyway. Future games require more of that. In 3rd edition D20 Modern, you had skill ranks, not just proficiency. Which meant that characters were far more customized, these choices were far more impactful and meaningful, and it meant you could model different characters better. I wish they'd go back to it, but alas no. Advanced classes included Ambassador, Dogfighter, Dreadnought, Engineer, Explorer, Field Officer, Helix Warrior, Space Monkey, Swindler, Techno-Savant, Tracer, and Xenophile, and there are other advanced classes scattered throughout the book rather than being brought together, which is kind of annoying and bad for reference. You can see that Star Wars was on their mind. I mean, the Saga edition would come out in 2007. I think they had a previous edition already out, and you can tell the influence is there from what they've been thinking about. You can also tell very easily that Monty Cook was involved in this book. Has his sort of signature obsessions and ideas rear up now and again. Now, I'm not as familiar with a lot of the old TSR stuff as I would perhaps like to be or should be, but it just held no interest for me at the time. I'm also not particularly familiar with Polyhedron magazine. But it appears that the campaigns section is home for orphaned games and stillborn ideas from Polyhedron and from previous TSR properties. So a way of keeping those intellectual properties in-house, perhaps. Bug Hunters was an Aliens/Starship Troopers pastiche with a previous version under the Amazing Engine system, another thing I have no experience of. Dimension X is a parallel universe jumping game, which, that's pretty obviously Monte Cook's obsessions even to this day. From the Dark Heart of Space is a Fifth Element/Cthulhu pastiche. Gene Tech is contestedly supposed to be an adaptation of the Moreau books, allegedly. Never read them. And that was a setting that was originally in Polyhedron as well. Mecha Crusade is a Gundam clone, originally in Polyhedron again. Star Drive is a re-expression of Alternities. Star Lore is an update of Star Frontiers. The Wasteland draws elements from Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World. And each of those settings gets a handful of pages, maybe a class, if you're lucky. And it just doesn't seem worth it for the space in the book. Settings need more than that, really. It's barely an elevator pitch. Those pages should have gone on and been reused to expand on other things, or even notes on making your own campaign worlds, any of which would have been vastly more useful. But if it was a matter of reasserting ownership over those intellectual properties, then you can see why they would include it that way. If you've got it, it's a shame not to use it. The gear section uses a gadget system, which works a little bit like monster templates. These are add-ons and modifications that you can give to the baseline statistics of gear and equipment that you might have. It's a good way to do things. They could have gone even looser and played into the gadgets even more, but they didn't. And again, it suffers from trying to be all things to all men, and yet D20, D&D was never meant to be a universal system, and it doesn't work as a universal system, no matter how much you kind of beat and hammer it. And I think that's a problem with a lot of OSR games today. You can tweak a fantasy system into working with other things, kind of, and sci-fantasy works a bit better, but ultimately it's like, I don't know, putting a spoiler on a Robin Reliant. It's just not built for speed, and the spoiler ends up looking a little bit ridiculous. So there's a lot of stuff that could have been a different game, basically. And by trying to be a general universalist thing, nothing really gets looked into enough. The environment section perhaps gets the shortest shrift. Sure, it covers all the typical sci-fi hazards, but the star system generation system is just pathetic. And something far more important, with far more scope for games than a lot of the other material that they did end up spending time and precious page real estate on. I mean, you've got to remember, this was very much a Johnny-come-lately. Traveller D20 came out in 2002 and does like 80% of what's in this book, 90% better than what's in this book. So, what is the point of you? And that describes most of the rest of the book, really. It's a shallow skim across topics that need more time spent on them, more depth. Things like mecha and starships and FTL and gene splicing and cybernetics. Some of these would be addressed in greater depth in supplements to this supplement. But it does feel like Wizards were kind of scrambling at the time, trying to cover a lot of bases, trying to compete with all of these D20 games that were coming out and doing what they did, but so much better. Which kind of feels like where we've been at throughout 5th edition for the most part, and feels like where we're at with 6th edition, or D&D 2024, again, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, this is emblematic of the kind of confusion and panic even of the time. I feel, I could be wrong. It's been known to happen, but that's what it feels like in hindsight, looking back on the context of the time and interpreting the book based on what I know, what I remember. In terms of style, I would give this book a high 3. I much prefer the graphical style, the cleaner illustrations, and so on. It has a far stronger visual identity as a result than much of what we've seen in later editions. Things seem to kind of regress in later editions, or later Wizards material. But the tiny font and the way in which everything kind of bleeds together, these aren't good, helpful, or useful things about the book, and so its utility nosedives. And it is possible to be both stylish and utilitarian. Form follows function. Utilitarian things have their own beauty. But I think there are just too many compromises as a result of the admirable decision to try and cram as much material in here as possible. However, despite that, I would only give it a substance score of 2, because it's just too shallow. It's trying to do everything, and as a result it doesn't do anything in a satisfying or particularly interesting way. So the practical upshot is that gives it a total of 5 out of 10, or 2.5 out of 5. So that is below average, especially for a professional product from the largest company at the time and the largest company now. I think it still has some value for collectors and game historians and completionists. If you had this and all the other D20 modern and D20 future material and books, then you might have something approaching a complete game with enough depth to really get a campaign out of. But the fact of the matter is, third-party companies and single-setting source material like Traveller 20 just did it better, and other systems than D20 did it better. So why would you, really? I think you can see some of the DNA from this in later releases by Monte Cook Games, or things that turned up in Starfinder. You can see similar ideas coming through there, and not that surprising to see similar ideas in the kind of inheritance of Starfinder, given who Paizo are and what they did in the past. So it's an interesting time capsule, but just not that interesting as a game or source book in and of itself, unfortunately. Zang.
A lapidary of wondrous stones and a bestiary of sundry creatures are 2 OSR resources by Neil Coates, providing you with the alchemical and magical supposed properties of stones, and a bestiary of all the strange creatures in their original interpretations in medieval lore. Available at lulu.com, DriveThruRPG, and post-mort.com.
And this is not a time to be dismayed. This is punk rock time. This is what Joe Strummer trained you for. It is now time to go. You're a good person. That means more now than ever.